Hi, it's Red, and today I'm going to be reading some r/NuclearRevenge. Are you ready for some intense revenge? Yep. Okay, here it is. Insult me in front of my staff? Say goodbye to your family's political career. I live in an economically developing nation, used to be heavily dependent on agriculture produce for economic activity. My grandfather was a farmer and he wanted his children to get educated and get a government job. So my dad got his master's from the only university we had in our region. Since most people study from the same university and get government jobs, so everyone in the government offices knew one another in some way. My dad was offered the position of officer in charge of our home state for the agriculture department and had around 40 people working under him. His task was to take care of agriculture and its related activities and act as advisor to the local farming community via local newspapers. During the 1980s and early 1990s, our country had long droughts and famines. The then government decided to create two different government agencies to take care of food security. One agency will take care of buying and storing food grains, and another agency was tasked to enable building the infrastructure for food security. Dad was attached to the agency which was tasked with infrastructure. His agency's job was to give grants for anyone building infrastructure for food security. His duty was providing grants to anyone who's building warehouses for food storage. His job was to review the entire warehouse from planning to construction that can store food and provide a third of a project cost as a grant subsidy to people who build it. This was the time when my country was doing all the stuff on paper, no computers, only typewriters, in government offices and no cell phone. Your options were limited to a fixed telephone line and fax copying machines, which were mind-blowing technology for my dad, and were new to the government offices. My dad used to do tons of paperwork in the office, reading through stuff, adding remarks, writing stuff. Add to that, you had postal service that took somewhere between 7 to 10 days to have your mail delivered to the nearest town or city. Yeah, those were the times my dad lived. In the late 90s, my dad was doing his work at his office when a commotion at the office entrance gets my dad's attention. He sees from the office window where 10 expensive cars are parked and a group of thugs holding the collared security personnel while warning them with long sticks and knives. My country didn't have armed security for government buildings back then. Security folks usually had small sticks. There were several unauthorized people entering the building. You see, people were not allowed inside any government office unless they state the purpose to the officer in charge and the officer permits the security to allow them. Suddenly Bill, who was the brother-in-law of a well-known politician, and his men walked into my dad's office, pushing my dad's staff away. Bill introduced himself and mentions that he is the brother-in-law of Jack, the senator from our region. He calls himself one of the powerful people in the region. He sits in my dad's chair, then drinks coffee and eats the cookies that were ordered for my dad, which was kept on his desk. Bill informs his men to go easy on my dad's staff as they start to drink coffee and eat cookies that were meant for the employees. Bill tells my dad that he was there to discuss the grant the government provides for a project that he was planning. My dad, at times, is submissive to people in positions of power, as he'd seen consequences first and hard of some of his friends losing their jobs or lives standing against powerful people. So Dad asked for the details of the project Bill was planning and asked him to send over the project proposal and an official request for the grant to him for reviewing, and informed Bill that the grant cannot be processed until the project is completed. Bill gets angry and says that any proposal for the project is enough to qualify for the grant and should be paid up front for the project construction. My dad tells him how the grant works and the project should be completed in order to qualify for the grant. Bill is pissed by this point and yells at my dad and his office staff how government officials were educated morons and are running the country into a grave. Bill takes all the necessary forms and applications from my dad and leaves the office furiously. Since nothing serious really happened, my dad wasn't bothered much about the incident. A few weeks go by, my dad receives a huge set of documents via the postal service. And you might have guessed it, those documents were related to Bill's project. Going through those documents, my dad identifies that they came from Dave, a consultant who was doing work on behalf of Bill, and the documents further reveal that warehouse proposed in the region was big enough to hold enough food grains to feed a population equivalent for 2 states for an entire year. The proposed project would cost them $1.5 billion, and once completed it would cost the government $300 million in the grant. This was a huge amount for Dad to handle. To that time, the largest project he'd ever reviewed for providing the grant was $50,000. That's the total project cost, not the grant. Building such infrastructure would mean that any other warehouse existing to be built in the region would be rendered useless. He quickly called his boss, asking him what he was supposed to do. His boss quickly looks at the rules and tells my dad that since there was no upper limit on the size of the warehouse or project cost, the only thing they could do was to review and process the application, and if everything checks out, they might end up paying $300 million in grant money. Since his boss okayed the processing of the application, my dad further reviewed the project proposal to identify the warehouse was specifically designed for industrial use and not for storing food grains. Since his boss okayed the processing of the application, my dad further reviewed the project proposal to identify the warehouse was specifically designed for industrial use and not for storing food grains. Dad was confused, so he gives a call to Dave. Dave informs my dad that he was hired to plan for a warehouse for industrial and there might have been some confusion over the details, and Dave promises that he would fix it and not reject the application based on those terms. Unsure of details, he decides to process the application and sends a note to Dave that the government would be reviewing the application, and once the project is completed, he should be informed about project completion, and my dad would visit the premises and give the final approval after reviewing it. It would take another 3 to 6 months at that time to get the grant money, as a check from the government after a review process is done. 2 years go by. Dave comes to my dad's office in an expensive luxury SUV and dares the security personnel to stop him if they want to keep their jobs. Dave rushes into my dad's office and asks if my dad was available on that day to visit the premises and give final approval for the project. Unsure who Dave was and asked for clarification and why he would need to do the approval today, Dad also informs Dave that there is a lot of documentation work that needs to be prepared before visiting the warehouse to give final approval. That would take at least 2 days for my dad. Dave tries to reason with my dad that he came from a far-off city and he couldn't stay for long to get this completed. My dad again tells Dave that 2 days is the minimum it would take for him to get the documentation ready. Dave, now angry, informs my dad that he represents Bill and Jack, and the warehouse needs to be inspected today or he will lose his job. Dad was not buying it and told him again, 2 days or forget it. Dave leaves the office, warning my dad that he will face consequences. Dad calls his boss, informing him of what happened, and the boss tells my dad to take priority and inspect the warehouse at the earliest. 2 days later, my dad visits the warehouse, and to his surprise, he sees Dave on location. The first thing my dad noticed about the warehouse was that it was not built for food grains or any agricultural produce for that matter. It was built for industrial purposes. Dave gives my dad a tour of the entire warehouse, explaining to him how state-of-the-art it was for the time. My dad takes note of every detail of the warehouse and informs Dave that the grant cannot be approved due to the fact that the warehouse was not constructed with storing agricultural produce in mind, and no one with a sound mind would overlook the fact to approve the grant. Dave starts yelling and claiming my father was looking for a bribe by withholding their grant, and my dad would approve the grant once he gets paid off. Bill and Jack are being targeted for making money off them. None of that was true about my dad. He was an honest man his entire life. My dad leaves the warehouse, unsure of what he could do to get out of this situation. My dad was super confused about why Bill has built an industrial warehouse in the middle of nowhere, and the only major activity in the region was farming. So he decides to call up his friend Rob and ask him a few questions about how Rob's government agency, which provides construction and building permits, provided the permit for this warehouse. Rob takes a couple of days to identify some horrific realities. First, the plans of the warehouse showcase and request permit to be an industrial complex for storing manufacturing goods. Bill bribed his way through Rob's agency and got environmental clearance and other permits without conforming to standards. He was also able to identify a report for building completion that was forwarded to the agency's request for considering storing food grains. Last but not least, he was able to find a construction tax bill submitted to the agency stating that the construction cost of the warehouse is around $300 million, along with plans of creating an industrial zone for the region that was proposed to the Senate by Jack. This was news to my dad and Rob. They were shocked to know how Bill and Dave were able to inflate the cost of the warehouse, and they had plans to make the region a new industrial zone. My dad calls his boss and informs him that Bill's project seems fishy and he would reject the grant and would be forwarding him the documents once done. His boss tries to reason with him that it could be a career-ending move for both of them. Jack was trying to put pressure on the leader of the agency to have the grant approved. Rob decides to dig around to see if he can get any more information and found the contract paper that was sent to the Food Procurement and Storing Agency, which raised several more red flags. First, the contract stated an inflated rent for storing food grains. Then rent will be reviewed on a yearly basis based on market rate, and then the contract would make the agency pay for the next 15 years, irrespective of whether the agency stores food or not. Rob calls my dad with this information. Now my dad is furious to know how Bill and Jack are planning to rob the government and decides to reject the grant for their project. A few days later, Bill turns up at my dad's office along with Dave in the same manner they previously did, but now even more furious, asks my dad why he's not approving the grant for his project and why it's taking so much time. Dad tries to calmly reason with him, stating that it was not built as per norms, so he wouldn't be able to approve it. Bill turns red and fuming with anger. He can throw around as much money as my dad wanted to have his signature on the documents approving the grant. My dad refuses that. It's a crime to bribe an officer. Bill goes on telling my dad that he lives in a mansion filled with escort girls, and my dad can have as many as he likes. My dad refuses again. Bill now threatens my dad, saying he can get him removed from the job and replace him with someone else. Again, my dad firmly tells Bill that he can do whatever the hell he wants to do, but my dad will not approve the grant. This shouting match goes on for around 3 hours in front of the entire office staff, but my dad didn't budge. Bill starts swearing at my father, telling him that he must be impotent to pass off the offer of having that many escort girls. Which would cost my dad his entire year's salary if he hired them. He also goes on yelling how my dad's parents must have abandoned him as a child for refusing to bring fortune to his family. My dad has had enough of Bill by this point and asks Bill to leave his office. In the last attempt to threaten my dad, Bill asks his thugs to take care of him and leaves the office along with Dave. Bill's thugs threaten my dad at knife point, stating he needs to sign those papers, otherwise he will end up dead in a pile of rotten garbage. He also tells him that they'll wait for 1 month and expect those papers signed after that. The thugs then go on to ransack the entire office before leaving and also threaten the staff to make sure that their boss signs the damn papers for approving the grant. My dad calls Rob and informs him what had happened and asks him to fax all the documents collected so far about Bill's project, and he would be asking for those documents officially. Rob asks my dad what his plans were for those documents. My dad says, "I'm going to take them down. I've had enough from them." Rob tells my dad not to do anything crazy in the heat of the moment, but assured him that he would send the details to my dad. The same day, Rob faxed my dad around 2,000 documents. My dad then calls up his boss to inform him that he would be going on a 10-day vacation. By the end of the day, my dad leaves the office with all the documents related to Bill's project and the fax documents from Rob's and heads home. For the next 10 days, my dad sits at home going through every document, evidence he gathered with the help of Rob, and drafts his grant rejection letter with a lot of details, as he didn't want to leave a chance anyone who could replace him or higher up could reject his comments on the project and approve the grant. After the vacation, he goes back to the office and the staff was surprised to see him, as they were thinking Bill's men had abducted him, since he didn't inform anyone about his vacation plans. The same day, my dad asked his assistant to mail the documents to his boss as a confidential report. His assistant takes the documents and heads to the nearest post office. At the same moment, Bill's men come into my dad's office to check with him if he'd signed the documents or not, and he would be in serious trouble if it's not done. My dad lies to them that he has approved the grant and his assistant has just gone to mail those documents to his boss for processing. It would take up to 3 months for the grant to arrive. My dad also tells them to inform Bill that everything has been taken care of and there's nothing to worry about anymore. So my dad won't be bothered by Bill or his men any further. A week later, my dad's boss furiously calls and asks my dad about the grant rejection letter he sent him and how crazy my dad was, which could end up having both of them killed. My dad assures his boss that he's taking care of everything, including Bill and Jack, and there's nothing to worry about. And all his boss has to do is hold on to those documents for a month or so. A month later, a local newspaper breaks the story of how Jack was corrupt to the hilt and Bill was a partner in his crimes. The same morning, Bill is arrested from his mansion half naked and totally drunk, along with a lot of escort girls. Bill was charged with corruption, bribery, sex racketeering, money laundering, and murder. Bill's men were also arrested for murder and were sentenced to life, along with Bill. Jack was arrested for corruption, bribery, intimidation, and abuse of power. Jack made bail but never won the election again, eventually retiring from politics. A decade later, Bill testified against Jack for crimes they both committed, and Jack was sentenced to 15 years in jail. Dave was also charged with bribery, forgery, and money laundering. Dave fled the country to escape jail time. No one knows for sure where he is now. Police are still looking for him. No one ever knew how that happened to Bill and Jack, except Rob and my dad. You see, my dad took 10 days vacation, not just to hide from Bill's men, but he was planning to execute his perfect plan for revenge against Bill. He systematically documented every ounce of evidence he had and drafted a comprehensive report against Bill and Jack on how they planned to cheat the government and have the government cough up the money for nothing. Remember when he asked his assistant to mail the documents to his boss? He actually had mailed 4 copies of those documents. One for his boss, one for the rejection of the grant. The second was to the agency planning to store grain in Bill's warehouse, telling them to blacklist his property for non-compliance with standards. The third and fourth mails were sent as anonymous tips to a federal agency, equivalent to the FBI. Let's call it XBI. And to investigative journalists from a local newspaper. XBI was also informed that a copy was sent to the local newspaper. XBI and the investigative journalists did their own investigation and found that the money put into the warehouse project was Jack's entire stash of money that he'd got through bribes, commissions, and favors for doing things while he was in power. This money was laundered by Bill through a network of entities to fund the warehouse project and cook the books to inflate the project costs to get his money back from the government as a grant in legal form. The journalist also uncovered some government officials were murdered by Bill and his men for not doing what Bill asked them to do, and handed the evidence over to XBI. It took them a month to investigate and identify all the pieces of the puzzle to nab Bill and Jack. Neither XBI nor journalists were able to find out who sent those documents to them. My dad's boss took early retirement, and Dad became the director of the agency he worked for a few years later, eventually retiring 15 years after this incident. Bob retired a year later and narrated this entire story to our family at his retirement party. I still see the abandoned warehouse whenever I travel to my hometown from the city where I work. Wow, I always find Nuclear Revenge so intense, but it's so worth listening / reading. I hope you guys enjoyed that r/Nuclear Revenge story read by Red. Please give the video a like. And don't forget to subscribe. I make videos every day just for you. So click the bell and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening today.